There is something unusual about the way old mining records from Nevada are organized. Most historical records from large industrial operations follow a predictable pattern. They are incomplete in expected ways. Pages wear out, ink fades, documents get lost in moves or fires. That kind of incompleteness is random and uneven. But the gaps in the Comstock records are different. They are not random. They follow a pattern, and that pattern is worth examining carefully before drawing any conclusions. The Comstock Lode was not a small or poorly documented operation. It was one of the largest and most closely watched mining projects in American history. From the moment silver was discovered beneath Virginia City, Nevada, in 1859, the operation attracted serious attention. Investors from San Francisco poured money into it. Engineers from across the country were hired to manage it. Government surveyors tracked its output. Journalists reported on its progress. The financial stakes were enormous, and where financial stakes are enormous, documentation tends to be thorough. That is what makes the gaps unusual. When researchers examine the surviving Comstock records, most of what they find is exactly what you would expect. Detailed shift logs, equipment inventories, ore extraction reports, engineer assessments, company correspondence, the kind of paperwork that large industrial operations generate constantly and preserve carefully. For most of the mine's history and most of its depth levels, that documentation is intact. But at certain points, things change. Entries stop mid-sequence. Reports that should follow other reports are simply absent. Sections that appear in one version of a document do not appear in later versions of the same document. This does not happen evenly across the entire archive. It clusters. That clustering is the first thing worth paying attention to. If the gaps were spread randomly across all years and all depth levels, there would be little reason to question them. Old records get damaged. Pieces go missing. That is normal. But the gaps in the Comstock archive are not evenly distributed. They concentrate around a specific period and a specific range of depths. The deeper the operation went, particularly in the years between the mid-1870s and 1880, the more frequently documentation becomes incomplete, transferred, or simply absent. At first, that might seem like a coincidence related to the challenges of working at extreme depth during that period. But the pattern holds too consistently for that explanation to fully satisfy. It is also worth considering what kind of operation the Comstock was from a management perspective. The companies running these mines had significant financial obligations. They had investors expecting regular reporting. They had engineers whose professional reputations depended on accurate documentation. They had government surveyors whose job was oversight. In that environment, systematic gaps in record-keeping would have been noticed and corrected unless someone with authority decided they should not be corrected. That is a different kind of absence than the kind produced by neglect or accident. An absence produced by decision looks different from an absence produced by disorganization. The Comstock gaps look more like the former. Some of the men who worked the deeper levels left their own accounts, not in company records, which were controlled by management, but in personal notebooks, private letters, and later testimonies. Some of those accounts survived simply because they were kept in private hands rather than company archives. Others did not survive, or have not yet been located. The ones that do exist share certain characteristics. They describe the deeper levels of the mine in ways that go beyond standard mining documentation. They note things that were unusual, things that did not fit the expected geology, things that the writers themselves found difficult to explain using the knowledge available to them at the time. And in several cases, the men who wrote these accounts describe being told not to discuss what they had seen. That instruction, when it appears in multiple independent accounts from different men working at different times, becomes a detail worth examining. A single miner being told to stay quiet about something unusual could reflect any number of ordinary workplace situations. But when that same instruction appears across multiple accounts spanning several years, it suggests something more consistent. It suggests that whoever was managing the operation at those depth levels had an ongoing policy about what miners were permitted to report. The existence of such a policy would explain why the official records are incomplete. It would also explain why the private accounts that survive tend to share similar themes. The Comstock Lode itself is a well-understood geological formation in many respects. Silver and gold were deposited in the rock through volcanic activity over millions of years. The ore bodies followed predictable patterns that geologists and engineers learned to map over time. At the shallower levels, everything the miners found matched what geology predicted. The ore was where the models said it would be. The rock formations behaved as expected. The tunnels progressed through terrain that surprised no one with serious geological knowledge. But several accounts, including ones written by men with formal geological training, describe a point at which the expected geology stopped matching what was actually being found. That transition point sits in roughly the same depth range where the documentation gaps begin. This raises a question that does not have a clean answer. If the geology at the deeper levels was simply more extreme, but still consistent with known formations, there would be no reason for experienced engineers to find it noteworthy in the way they did. Extreme heat and high pressure were expected at those depths. Unusual mineral concentrations were not uncommon in the Comstock, but the language used in the accounts that survive from those depths is not the language of men encountering extreme but explainable geology. It is the language of men encountering something they do not have a ready framework for. That distinction matters when trying to understand why the records behave differently at those levels. At first, it seems normal that a major mining operation would occasionally encounter geological surprises and choose to manage the information carefully to avoid unsettling investors or workers. That is a reasonable business decision. Mining companies in the 19th century were not known for their transparency, and there were strong financial incentives to control the narrative around operations that attracted significant investment. A sealed shaft with an unexplained notation could reflect any number of practical concerns that had nothing to do with anything unusual. But there's a problem with that explanation when applied to the Comstock specifically. The problem is consistency. If the gaps and sealed sections reflected ordinary business concerns, they would appear somewhat randomly across the operation's history, corresponding to financial pressures, management changes, equipment failures, or safety incidents. Instead, they appear in a specific pattern, concentrating at specific depths and in specific time windows. That concentration is difficult to account for through ordinary operational explanations. It suggests that whatever was driving the documentation gaps was tied to something specific, not to general business conditions. There is also the matter of what happened to certain individuals within the company structure during the relevant period. Engineers who raised questions about the deeper levels were reassigned or removed from their positions. In at least one documented case, a chief engineer recommended bringing in outside specialists to investigate something his team had encountered. He was replaced shortly after making that recommendation. His replacement had a financial background rather than a technical one. That sequence could reflect routine management decisions, but it also fits a pattern of removing people whose professional instincts led them toward investigation rather than toward acceptance of the official explanation. The men who worked the deepest levels were not inexperienced laborers making uninformed observations. Many of them had decades of underground experience across multiple countries and multiple types of mining operations. They understood rock. They understood the difference between a natural formation and something that did not belong in a natural formation. They understood the difference between a collapse caused by geological pressure and a blockage created by deliberate construction. When men with that level of experience describe what they found in terms that suggest genuine confusion and concern, that is not easily dismissed as misinterpretation or overactive imagination. It does not fully make sense that a mining operation as large and as thoroughly documented as the Comstock would develop systematic gaps in its records at exactly the depth levels where experienced miners began reporting unusual observations, unless those two things were connected. The simplest connection between them is that something was found at those depths that the people managing the operation did not want documented in the standard way. Whether that something was commercially sensitive, scientifically inconvenient, or genuinely difficult to explain is a separate question. The fact that the documentation changes at the same point the observations change is a connection worth examining seriously. The Comstock records that do survive are held across several institutions. Some are with historical societies in Nevada. Some are in university archives. Some remain in private collections. Researchers who have examined them across different institutions have noted that the pattern of gaps is consistent regardless of where the records are held. That consistency across separate archives is another detail that is difficult to explain through accidental loss. Documents held in different locations by different institutions going missing in the same pattern suggests that the gaps were created before the records were distributed, not after. That places the origin of the gaps within the operation itself, during the period when the records were still under company control. None of this establishes with certainty that the deeper levels of the Comstock contain something genuinely unexplained. What it establishes is that the documentation record has properties that are inconsistent with ordinary record-keeping failure. The gaps are patterned. They cluster at specific depths. They coincide with the period when unusual observations were being reported by experienced workers. They appear consistently across separate archives, and they correspond with a series of personnel decisions that removed technically minded individuals from positions where they might have investigated further. Each of those details has a possible ordinary explanation, but the combination of all of them, appearing together, concentrated in the same period and the same depth range, is harder to explain away. The deeper levels of the Comstock are still sealed. The official reasons involve structural instability and safety concerns. Those reasons may be entirely valid. Old mine workings at extreme depths present genuine hazards, and there is no straightforward way to verify the current structural condition of tunnels that have been sealed for over a century. But those same sealed sections are the ones where the documentation gaps cluster. They are the sections where experienced miners left unusual accounts. They are the sections where engineers were replaced after raising questions. The combination of physical inaccessibility and archival incompleteness means that whatever was found at those depths remains, for now, unverifiable in either direction. And that is precisely why the question does not go away. If the deeper levels contained nothing unusual, the record should reflect that clearly. The fact that they do not is the starting point for everything that follows. The accepted explanation for the Comstock Lode begins simply enough. In 1859, two men were digging near Gold Hill in what is now western Nevada. Their names were Patrick McLaughlin and Peter O'Reilly. They were not looking for silver. They were looking for water. The region was dry, and water was a practical necessity for any kind of surface mining work. What they found instead would change the economic history of the American West within a matter of months. Beneath a thin layer of soil and loose rock, they struck ore. Not just any ore. Silver mixed with gold, concentrated in quantities that were difficult to believe at first examination. The discovery was real. The wealth it represented was real. And the rush that followed was one of the largest in American history. Word traveled fast. In 1859, California had already experienced the gold rush a decade earlier, and a large population of experienced prospectors was still living in the region, ready to move at the first credible report of a new strike. Within weeks of the McLaughlin and O'Reilly discovery, men were moving east across the Sierra Nevada mountains toward Nevada. Within months, the area around Gold Hill and the nearby 6 Mile Canyon had transformed from empty desert into a crowded and chaotic mining settlement. The speed of that transformation says something about how significant the find was. People do not cross mountain ranges in large numbers for uncertain prospects. The Comstock silver was drawing them because early reports of its richness were being confirmed by actual extraction. Virginia City grew out of that rush. It was not planned. It was not gradual. It appeared because the mine was there and because the mine required labor, supply chains, housing, and services. Within a few years, Virginia City had a population that rivaled established cities in California. It had newspapers, hotels, theaters, and churches. It had a stock exchange dedicated almost entirely to Comstock mining shares. The financial architecture that developed around the Comstock was sophisticated and substantial. This was not a temporary camp. It was a functioning city built on the expectation that the silver would continue to flow for a long time. And for a while it did. The technical challenges of extracting that silver were significant. The ore bodies extended deep into the earth, far deeper than surface or shallow mining could reach. Going deeper required solving problems that had not been fully solved before in American mining. One of the most serious was structural. The rock surrounding the ore bodies tended to shift and collapse under pressure as tunnels extended downward. A German engineer named Philipp Deichheimer developed a system of interlocking wooden frames, called square sets, that could support the walls and ceiling of large underground chambers as work progressed. That system became standard in deep mining operations across the country. It was one of several genuine engineering achievements that came out of the Comstock. Heat was another problem. As the mines went deeper, temperatures climbed in ways that made normal working conditions impossible. By the time operations reached depths of around 2,000 feet in the early 1870s, underground temperatures were regularly exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. At 3,000 feet, they went past 140 degrees. Water seeping through the rock at those depths was hot enough to scald. Men working at those levels could not stay underground for more than 20 minutes at a time without risking serious heat injury. Managing that reality required ventilation systems, ice brought down in large quantities, and careful rotation of workers. The logistical complexity of keeping men alive and productive at those depths was considerable. The official record acknowledges this and presents it as evidence of human determination and industrial problem-solving. That framing is accurate as far as it goes. The Comstock did produce genuine engineering innovation. The challenges were real, and the solutions developed to address them were practical and lasting. The square-set timbering system, the ventilation approaches, and the hoisting technology developed for the Comstock influenced mining practice well beyond Nevada. When the history books describe the Comstock as a story of industrial progress, they are not wrong. The problem is not that the official version contains false information. The problem is that it may not contain all of the relevant information. A story can be accurate in every detail it includes and still be incomplete in ways that matter. The financial history of the Comstock follows a recognizable arc. Early extraction was enormously profitable. The richest ore bodies, found at relatively accessible depths, produced returns that justified the massive investment in infrastructure and equipment. As those upper ore bodies were worked out, the mines went deeper in search of new deposits. The deeper work was more expensive, more dangerous, and produced diminishing returns over time. By the early 1880s, the most productive period was clearly ending. Companies began consolidating. Employment dropped. Virginia City's population fell sharply. By the late 1880s, the mines were largely idle. The official explanation for this decline is straightforward. The silver ran out. The cost of extracting what remained exceeded the value of the ore. The operation became economically unviable and was shut down. That explanation is standard and widely accepted. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the decline of the Comstock did not follow exactly the pattern that simple ore depletion would predict. In a typical mining operation, as ore bodies are worked out, the extraction reports show a gradual decline in ore quality and quantity. Engineers adjust their projections. Companies scale back investment in proportion to declining returns. The shutdown, when it comes, is orderly and well documented because the data leading up to it clearly supports the decision. Some of that pattern is visible in the Comstock records, but not all of it. Certain decisions made in the late 1870s and early 1880s do not map cleanly onto a simple story of declining ore quality. Some sections of the mine were sealed and abandoned earlier than the depletion timeline would suggest. In a few cases, sections that had been producing or were closed before the ore in them was fully extracted. The reasons given in the surviving records vary. Structural instability is mentioned frequently. Gas hazards appear as an explanation in several entries. These are legitimate mining concerns, and it would be wrong to assume that every sealed section conceals something unusual. Mines are dangerous environments, and practical safety decisions do produce sealed sections. But the pattern of which sections were sealed and when does not align perfectly with the pattern of where the ore bodies were located and how depleted they were. At first, it seems normal that a large mining operation would accumulate various sealed sections over decades of work. That is expected. But there is a problem when the sealed sections cluster in a specific depth range and correspond with a specific period of the operation's history. The concentration of sealed sections in the deeper levels during the late 1870s is notable because that concentration does not match the distribution of the ore bodies. If sections were being sealed purely for safety reasons related to structural instability, you would expect those closures to occur throughout the mine's history and throughout its depth range, wherever the geology was weakest. Instead, the closures cluster. That clustering is worth examining. The official record presents the Comstock as a well-understood system. Engineers mapped it. Geologists analyzed it. The ore bodies were identified, extracted, and eventually depleted. That is the framework within which the history is written. And within that framework, the sealed sections are simply the expected byproduct of a long and complex industrial operation. Nothing about them requires further explanation. That is the position the official record takes, and it is stated clearly and confidently. But confidence in a position is not the same as completeness of evidence. A position can be stated with full confidence, while still leaving certain details unaddressed. The documentation from the Comstock that does survive is extensive enough to establish the general outline of the operation clearly, but it is also extensive enough to show, through its own gaps and inconsistencies, that the general outline may not account for everything that was found and recorded during those decades of deep mining. The accounts that survive from individual miners, written outside the official company structure, sometimes describe the deeper levels in terms that do not match the official geological characterization of those areas. Those discrepancies are not large enough or dramatic enough to overturn the official history on their own, but they are consistent enough across multiple independent sources to raise questions that the official record does not directly address. The story of how the Comstock was discovered, developed, and eventually closed is a story that American industrial history is comfortable with. It fits a familiar pattern of resource extraction, technological innovation, economic boom, and eventual decline. That pattern is real, and the Comstock fits it in many important ways. But historical events rarely fit their explanatory frameworks with perfect completeness. There are always details at the edges that require more attention than the main narrative gives them. With the Comstock, those edge details tend to cluster in the same place. The deeper levels, the later years of operation, and the records associated with both. The men who ran the Comstock were not mysterious figures. They were businessmen, engineers, and investors operating in a well-documented public environment. Their decisions were driven by financial considerations and practical concerns. There's no reason to assume that their management of the operation was unusual in most respects. But some of their decisions, particularly around the sealing of certain sections and the management of information from the deeper levels, do not have obvious explanations within the framework of ordinary business practice. That does not mean the explanations do not exist. It means they have not been clearly established in the surviving record. The clean version of the Comstock story is the one found in textbooks and historical summaries. 2 men found silver. A city was built. The silver ran out. The city emptied. Engineers solved problems along the way. That version is useful and largely accurate. It accounts for the major economic and industrial dimensions of the story, but it does not account for every detail in the surviving documentation. Some of those unaccounted details are minor and probably insignificant. Others are more persistent. They appear in multiple sources. They describe the same depth range. They involve the same kinds of observations and the same kinds of institutional responses, and they have not been clearly explained by the version of the story that is currently accepted. The Comstock Lode is considered a closed chapter in American mining history. The mines have been sealed for over a century. The city built above them is a small tourist destination today. The silver is gone. The companies are long dissolved. The engineers and miners who worked those depths are long dead. In most respects, there is nothing left to investigate. But the records that survive, imperfect and incomplete as they are, continue to contain details that the standard explanation does not fully account for. And the sections of the mine where those details are concentrated remain sealed and inaccessible. Whether that inaccessibility is purely practical or partly deliberate is a question the surviving record does not clearly answer. The first problem with the official explanation is a simple one. It does not involve dramatic discoveries or unusual artifacts. It involves paperwork. Specifically, it involves the way certain sections of the Comstock's official documentation behave differently from the rest of the archive. That difference is subtle but consistent, and it is the kind of thing that tends to go unnoticed unless someone is looking at the records carefully and with a trained eye. Most people who encounter the Comstock story encounter it through summary histories and general accounts. Those summaries do not spend much time on the internal documentation of the mining operation, but the internal documentation is where the first serious questions begin. Large mining operations in the 19th century depended on precise record-keeping in ways that are easy to underestimate today. The financial structure of a major mine required it. Investors were putting significant capital into these operations with the expectation of returns, and those returns depended entirely on what was being extracted, from where, and at what cost. To satisfy that requirement, engineers maintained detailed maps of every shaft, every tunnel, and every chamber. Those maps were updated regularly as the work progressed. They were not optional documents. They were financial instruments. An investor or auditor reviewing the operation needed to be able to look at a map and understand exactly what had been done, what was currently being worked, and what remained to be extracted. Without that level of documentation, the financial management of the operation would have been impossible. That context matters because it establishes a baseline. In a well-run mining operation of the Comstock scale, every significant event underground should appear somewhere in the record. A shaft becomes unstable. There should be an engineer's assessment explaining why, describing the nature of the instability, and recommending a course of action. A section is sealed. There should be documentation of the decision, the reason, and the expected impact on the surrounding work. A tunnel is abandoned. There should be a record explaining whether the ore body was depleted, whether a safety hazard made continuation impractical, or whether the decision was financial. These are not bureaucratic formalities. They are the basic records that allow a complex underground operation to be managed safely and profitably. When researchers examine the surviving Comstock maps and engineering records, most of what they find meets that baseline. The majority of the documentation is exactly what the financial and operational requirements would predict. Shafts are mapped. Chambers are dimensioned. Ore bodies are described. Engineer assessments follow incidents. The archive, taken as a whole, is substantial and detailed. That is what makes the exceptions visible. Against a background of thorough documentation, a gap stands out, and the gaps in the Comstock record are not small or isolated. They are specific and they are patterned. Certain shafts appear on early versions of the operational maps and then disappear from later versions, without explanation. This is not the same as a shaft being marked as depleted or sealed for a stated reason. A depleted shaft gets a notation. A sealed shaft gets a reason. These shafts simply stop appearing. They are present in one document and absent in the next version of the same document, with no entry marking the transition. For an operation as carefully documented as the Comstock, that kind of silent disappearance is unusual. It does not fit the standard pattern of how mining records handle the closure of worked sections. Other sections are marked as unstable or inaccessible, but the supporting documentation for those designations is missing. In standard practice, a stability assessment would accompany any decision to seal a section. An engineer would inspect the area, describe the nature of the instability, and make a recommendation. That recommendation would be signed, dated, and filed. The decision to act on it would also be recorded. What survives in some portions of the Comstock archive is only the outcome, a notation that a section is sealed, with none of the process that should have preceded it. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The absence of process documentation does not just mean a record is incomplete. It means the decision was either made without following standard procedure, or the records of the procedure were removed afterward. It is worth being careful here about what this does and does not suggest. Missing documentation in a 19th century archive does not automatically indicate concealment. Records were lost to fires, floods, moves, and simple neglect. Paper degrades. Institutions close, and their holdings get scattered. Any large historical archive will have gaps that have entirely ordinary explanations. That is a legitimate point, and it applies to the Comstock records as well. Some portion of the missing documentation almost certainly disappeared through ordinary processes of loss and deterioration. The question is whether all of it did, and this is where it becomes unclear, because the gaps do not behave the way ordinary archival loss behaves. Ordinary archival loss is essentially random. It affects documents across different time periods, different subject areas, and different types of records in proportion to how those records were stored and handled. It does not concentrate. It does not cluster around specific topics or specific depth levels. The Comstock gaps do cluster. They concentrate in the records associated with the deeper levels of the operation, particularly in the period from the mid-1870s onward. That concentration is the detail that separates these gaps from ordinary archival deterioration. Random loss would not produce a pattern this specific. A pattern this specific points towards something more deliberate, though what exactly drove it remains an open question. Cave-ins and gas pockets are the explanations most commonly offered for sealed sections in historical mining records. Both are genuine and serious hazards. Both occurred regularly at the Comstock and throughout the mining operations of that era. A cave-in could make a section permanently inaccessible. A gas pocket could make continued work too dangerous to justify. These are real operational reasons for sealing sections of a mine, and they are well documented throughout the Comstock archive. When a cave-in occurred, it was recorded. When a gas hazard was identified, it was assessed and documented. The mining companies had strong practical incentives to document these events accurately, both for safety management and for insurance and investor reporting purposes. So the documentation of genuine hazards is largely intact. But this is where it becomes unclear. The sections with missing explanations are not the sections where cave-ins and gas hazards are well documented. They are different sections. If all the unexplained closures were clustered in areas where geological instability was already established, the missing documentation could be explained as redundant records that were not preserved because the general hazard was already known. That is not the pattern. The unexplained closures sit in areas where the surrounding documentation does not indicate the kind of hazards that would normally justify sealing without detailed explanation. That separation between the documented hazards and the unexplained closures is a detail that the standard narrative does not clearly address. Thomas Watkins noticed this. He was not the first person to work at the Comstock, and he was not the most senior figure in its management, but his background gave him a specific kind of perspective that most of the people reviewing those records did not share. He had spent decades working underground across multiple countries and multiple types of mining operations. He understood the documentation requirements of large mining projects from direct experience. When he was promoted to shift supervisor in 1874, he gained access to the company logs and operational maps that were not available to ordinary miners. And what he found in those records was not what he expected to find. Watkins began noticing discrepancies. Sections marked as unstable with no supporting assessment. Shafts that appeared on earlier maps but had been quietly removed from current versions. Sealed areas where the stated reason did not match what could be observed in adjacent sections. He was careful about what he did with these observations. He was experienced enough to understand the professional risk of raising questions that management did not want raised. But he continued looking, and the more carefully he looked, the more the discrepancies accumulated. They were not dramatic. They were the kind of small, persistent inconsistencies that only become significant when they are viewed together rather than individually. What made Watkins' position unusual was the combination of his practical underground experience and his access to the administrative records. Most miners with his depth of practical knowledge did not have access to the company logs. Most administrators who reviewed the logs did not have his underground experience. Watkins sat at the intersection of both, and that position allowed him to see connections that others might have missed. A notation in a log that looked unremarkable to a financial reviewer looked different to someone who had personally examined the corresponding section underground and found that the stated reason for its closure did not match what the rock and the tunnel structure actually showed. The records he was examining were not secret documents. They were the standard operational logs of a large mining company, but access to them was limited to supervisory staff, and reviewing them carefully was not a formal part of anyone's job description. Most people who encountered those records were looking for specific operational information, not examining them for internal consistency. Watkins was doing something different. He was reading them the way an auditor reads a set of accounts, looking not just at individual entries, but at how those entries related to each other and whether the overall picture they presented was coherent. and the picture was not fully coherent. The question that emerged from his review was straightforward. In an operation as carefully documented as the Comstock, unexplained sealed sections were an anomaly. They required explanation. The standard explanations available, cave-ins, gas hazards, structural instability, were already well documented in other parts of the same archive. The fact that those same explanations were absent from specific sections, while being present and detailed in others, suggested that the reason for sealing those sections was something that the standard explanations did not cover. Watkins did not know at that point what that reason was. He only knew that the records did not add up in the way they should have for an operation of this scale and this level of professional management. That observation led him in a specific direction. The sealed sections with missing explanations were not distributed evenly across the mine. They were concentrated at the deeper levels. That concentration gave his inquiry a geographic focus. Whatever was creating the documentation gaps was located below a certain depth, and in a mine that was actively being extended downward during that period. The deeper levels were not historical territory. They were the current frontier of the operation. Watkins was a shift supervisor with legitimate access to those levels. The question of what was actually down there, and why the records about it behaved differently from everything above, was one he was positioned to investigate directly. What he eventually found when he did goes beyond what the documentation gaps alone could suggest. But the documentation gaps are where the question begins. They are the first indication that the official version of what happened at the deeper levels of the Comstock may not be the complete version. To understand what Thomas Watkins noticed at the Comstock, it helps to understand who Thomas Watkins was before he ever set foot in Nevada. His background is not incidental to the story. It is central to it. The observations he made underground were not the observations of someone encountering mining for the first time, or even for the 10th time. They were the observations of a man who had spent more years underground than most people spend in any single profession. That level of experience produces a specific kind of knowledge. It is not the kind that comes from textbooks or engineering manuals. It is the kind that comes from decades of direct physical contact with rock, timber, earth, and the structures that human beings build inside all of them. Watkins was born in Wales in 1834. He began working in the coal mines of South Wales when he was 8 years old. That was not unusual for the time and place. Child labor in Welsh coal mines was common throughout the early and middle parts of the 19th century. Children were used for tasks that required small bodies in narrow spaces. The work was dangerous, and the conditions were poor by any standard. But it was also an education of a very specific kind. A child who spent years moving through underground tunnels, observing how rock behaved under pressure, watching experienced miners read the walls and ceilings for signs of instability, absorbed a body of practical knowledge that could not be acquired any other way. By the time Watkins was a young adult, he had already accumulated more underground experience than most people ever would. The Welsh coal mines of that period were among the deepest in the world. They faced engineering challenges that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible at the time. Watkins worked through 2 serious cave-ins during his years there. He witnessed a gas explosion that killed 11 men in a single shift. Those were not distant events that he read about afterward. He was present for them. He saw what they looked like, what they sounded like, and what they left behind. That kind of direct exposure to underground disaster produces a permanent attentiveness. Men who survive serious mining accidents in their early careers tend to develop a heightened awareness of their environment underground. They notice things that others walk past without registering. That attentiveness was part of what Watkins brought to the Comstock. He immigrated to California in 1856 at the age of 22. By that point, he had already spent 14 years working underground. He had experience with multiple types of rock, multiple tunneling methods, and multiple approaches to structural support. He had worked in conditions ranging from shallow surface mining to deep shaft work in coal seams far below the water table. When he arrived in America, the mining industry was still processing the aftermath of the California gold rush. Experienced miners with European training were in demand. Watkins found work without difficulty. He spent several years working in California before moving to Nevada, arriving at the Comstock in 1864, 5 years after the original silver discovery. For his first decade at the Comstock, Watkins worked standard assignments at standard depths. The work was demanding. The heat at the lower levels was intense even in those earlier years of the operation. But for someone with Watkins' background, the physical conditions were manageable. What occupied his attention was something else. From relatively early in his time at the Comstock, he began noticing small details that did not sit comfortably with his understanding of how underground spaces behave and how mining operations create them. These were not dramatic observations. They were subtle, and that subtlety is part of what makes them worth examining carefully. The first category of observations involved surface characteristics of the tunnel walls. In a standard mining operation, the walls of a tunnel carry the marks of how they were created. Pickaxe work leaves a distinctive pattern of impact marks, irregular and overlapping, following the angle and force of the blows. Drill work leaves circular holes of consistent diameter, placed according to a blasting plan. Blasting itself leaves a roughened, fragmented surface where the rock was broken by explosive force. An experienced miner looking at a tunnel wall can read those marks and understand the history of how the tunnel was made. The marks are like a record written directly into the rock. Watkins had been reading that record for decades by the time he arrived at the Comstock. At certain points in the Comstock tunnels, particularly at the lower levels, he found walls where that record was absent or inconsistent. Sections of wall that were too smooth, not polished in the way that water erosion produces smoothness, and not flat in the approximate way that careful pickaxe work might achieve over time. Smooth and flat in a way that did not match any excavation method Watkins had encountered in 2 decades of underground work across multiple countries. A wall like that raises a straightforward question. If the smoothness was not produced by the mining operation, and if it does not match any natural geological process Watkins recognized, then what produced it? That question does not have an obvious answer within the framework of standard mining geology. The corners were a related observation. In a mine tunnel or chamber, corners are rarely precise. They are approximately right-angled in well-managed operations, but close examination always reveals the irregularities introduced by the tools and methods used to create them. Perfect corners require finishing work that mining operations do not typically invest in. There's no practical reason to spend the additional time and effort achieving geometric precision in a mine tunnel. The tunnel needs to be structurally sound and large enough for the work being done. Beyond that, precision is unnecessary and therefore absent. But at certain locations in the deeper Comstock levels, Watkins found corners that met at angles too precise for the tools and methods being used. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Corners that precise do not appear by accident in rock. They are produced by deliberate finishing work of a kind that had no obvious purpose in a silver mine. The drill holes were perhaps the most technically specific of his early observations. Drilling in mining operations follows a plan. Holes are placed according to a blasting pattern designed by an engineer to break the rock in a controlled way. The placement of those holes is determined by the structure of the ore body being targeted and the geometry of the tunnel being created. An experienced miner who has spent years observing drill patterns can look at a set of holes and understand the logic behind their placement. The holes follow the operational requirement. They are placed where the engineer decided they needed to be, in rock that the operation was actively working through. But Watkins, at certain locations in the deeper tunnels, observed drill holes whose placement did not follow the pattern of the surrounding work. The holes appeared to follow a pattern already present in the rock, rather than a pattern imposed on it by the current operation. That is a distinction that requires significant experience to recognize, and even more experience to find unusual. Watkins had both. It is worth being careful about how much weight to place on observations of this kind. Rock formations can produce surfaces and shapes that superficially resemble artificial work. Mineral crystallization, pressure fracturing, and erosion by underground water can all create features that might initially suggest human modification. An observer without deep geological knowledge might mistake natural formations for artificial ones. But this is where Watkins' background becomes directly relevant. He was not an observer without deep geological knowledge. He had spent decades examining rock in the specific context of distinguishing what was naturally formed from what had been artificially modified. That distinction was practically important in mining work. Misreading a natural formation as an ore body, or misreading a structural weakness as solid rock, had serious consequences underground. Watkins had learned to make that distinction accurately over many years of work where the cost of getting it wrong was high. When he was promoted to shift supervisor in 1874, his access to information expanded. He could now review the company logs and operational maps that tracked the work across the entire mine. That administrative access added a new dimension to what he was already observing underground. The logs and maps did not just record what was being actively worked. They recorded the history of the operation, where shafts had been sunk, what chambers had been opened, which sections had been sealed, and why. For someone who had been noticing small physical inconsistencies at the lower levels for a decade, the administrative record provided a broader context for those inconsistencies. And the context did not resolve them. It added to them. What Watkins found in the logs was consistent with what he had been observing underground in one important respect. The inconsistencies were not evenly distributed. They were concentrated. In the logs, as in the tunnels themselves, the unusual details clustered at the lower levels. Sections that appeared in earlier maps without explanation in later ones. Sealed areas with missing documentation. Engineer notations that referred to conditions without describing them. These were the administrative equivalents of the physical observations he had been making. Details that did not fit the standard pattern, located in the same general part of the operation, accumulating over the same period of time. The combination of physical observation and administrative review gave Watkins a more complete picture than either source would have provided on its own. The physical observations told him that certain areas of the mine contained features that did not match standard mining work. The administrative records told him that those same areas were also the areas where the documentation behaved unusually. That alignment between what he was seeing in the rock and what he was finding in the paper records was significant. It suggested that whatever was creating the physical anomalies was also creating the documentation gaps. The two were connected, and the connection pointed consistently in one direction. That direction was downward. Every category of unusual observation, the physical details in the tunnels, and the administrative gaps in the logs, concentrated at the lower levels of the operation. The shallower sections of the mine, where the work was older and better understood, showed none of the same characteristics. The documentation for those levels was complete and consistent. The physical features of the tunnels at those levels matched what standard mining work produced. The deeper the operation went, the more frequently the anomalies appeared. That gradient was not random. It was a pattern, and a pattern that points consistently in one direction, across two independent categories of evidence observed over more than a decade, is the kind of pattern that a careful observer does not dismiss. Watkins was a careful observer. He had been trained to be one by circumstances that did not permit carelessness, and what he was observing at the Comstock, taken together across both the physical and administrative dimensions of his work, was building toward a question he had not yet been able to answer. The inconsistencies were real. They were consistent. They pointed downward, but what was down there that could account for all of them remained, at that point in his investigation, an open question. The records he was reviewing were incomplete by design or by accident, and the sections of the mine where the inconsistencies concentrated were the sections he had not yet had the opportunity to examine directly. That opportunity would come later, but the foundation for understanding what he eventually found was built during these years of quiet, careful observation, underground and in the company logs, before anyone had sent him to the deepest levels with instructions to document what was there. When Watkins began examining the sealed sections he could access as a shift supervisor, he was not expecting to find anything beyond the standard results of underground hazards. Cave-ins were common in deep mining operations. Gas pockets caused unexpected closures. Structural failures required sections to be abandoned. These were ordinary events in an extraordinary environment, and Watkins had encountered all of them over his decades of underground work. He knew what each one looked like in the aftermath. He knew the debris patterns, the wall conditions, the structural signatures that different kinds of underground failures left behind. That knowledge was not theoretical. It was built from direct observation across multiple mining operations over more than 20 years. And it was precisely that knowledge that told him something was wrong with what he was finding in certain sealed sections of the Comstock. The difference between a natural cave-in and a deliberately sealed passage is not subtle to someone who knows what to look for. A natural cave-in produces a specific kind of debris field. The fallen material consists of rock fragments from the immediate area, broken in patterns that reflect the direction and force of the collapse. The sizes of the fragments follow a natural distribution. The way they settle follows the physics of falling rock in an enclosed space. There's a randomness to it that is itself consistent and recognizable. The walls and ceiling near a natural collapse show the stress fractures and displacement patterns that preceded the failure. Everything about the physical evidence of a natural collapse tells the same story. Rock under pressure eventually gave way and fell. A deliberately sealed passage tells a completely different story. The materials used to fill it are not limited to what was immediately available from a collapse. They are assembled. Rubble is brought in and placed. In more thorough sealing operations, concrete or a similar binding material is added to stabilize the fill and prevent it from being easily removed. The fill is denser and more uniform than natural collapse debris. It does not have the random distribution of fallen rock. It has the organized quality of material that was placed by people working with a specific purpose. An experienced miner examining a sealed passage from the inside of an adjacent tunnel can usually identify these characteristics without difficulty. The physical evidence of deliberate sealing is distinct from the physical evidence of natural failure. Watkins examined multiple sealed sections during his years as shift supervisor. What he found consistently in the sections associated with the deeper levels was the second category, not natural collapses, deliberate blockages, rubble mixed with concrete, placed in a way that reflected intentional work rather than geological accident. That finding was significant for a straightforward reason. If a section was sealed deliberately, then a decision was made to seal it. That decision had a reason, and in a mining operation where every significant decision was supposed to be documented, the absence of documentation for those sealing operations was not a neutral fact. It was an active gap. Someone sealed those passages and chose not to record why. It is worth considering what the ordinary explanations for deliberate sealing might be. Mining companies sometimes sealed sections for reasons that had nothing to do with geological hazards. A section might be sealed to prevent unauthorized access to high-value ore bodies. It might be sealed as part of a legal dispute over mineral rights. It might be sealed for safety reasons that were considered obvious enough not to require detailed documentation. All of these are possible explanations. None of them fully accounts for the pattern Watkins was observing, because the sealing he found was concentrated in areas that did not correspond to any of these ordinary motivations. The sections were not adjacent to particularly rich ore bodies. They were not involved in any documented legal disputes. And the safety rationale, when it appeared at all in the surrounding records, was stated in terms too vague to be operationally meaningful. The drill bit failures added a separate and more technically specific dimension to what Watkins was finding. Drill bits in mining operations fail regularly. They are consumable tools working against hard rock under significant force, and they wear out or break as a normal part of the work. Mining companies track bit consumption carefully because it was a significant operational cost. The rate at which bits failed provided information about the hardness of the rock being worked and allowed engineers to adjust their methods and procurement accordingly. So bit failure rates were documented, and deviations from expected rates were noted. What the logs showed at the deeper levels of the Comstock during the late 1870s was a failure rate that was significantly higher than what the surrounding geology predicted. Drill bits were breaking against something harder than the rock that the geological surveys said should be there. The ore formations at those depths had been characterized by the company's geologists, and the expected hardness of the rock had informed the choice of drill bits and the planning of the work. But the bits were failing faster than that characterization would predict. This is where it becomes unclear, because there are two possible explanations for that discrepancy. Either the geological characterization of those areas was wrong, which would be a significant professional failure by the engineers involved, or the bits were encountering something that was not part of the characterized formation. Neither explanation is comfortable within the framework of the official record. Core samples were extracted from those depth levels as part of the standard geological assessment process. Core sampling involves drilling into the rock and removing a cylinder of material that can be examined in detail. It is one of the primary tools geologists use to understand underground formations. The samples taken from the problematic depth levels were examined, and the results of that examination were recorded. What the records described was rock that showed characteristics inconsistent with the surrounding formations in two important ways. The rock was significantly older than what surrounded it, and it showed evidence of exposure to controlled heat. That second characteristic is the more difficult one to explain within standard geology. Rock at depth is exposed to geothermal heat, which is the natural heat produced by the Earth's interior. Evidence of geothermal heat exposure in deep rock is expected and unremarkable. But geothermal heat and controlled heat are different things. Controlled heat, the kind produced by smelting or industrial processes, leaves different signatures in rock than geothermal heat does. The distinction is recognizable to a trained geologist examining core samples under appropriate conditions. The characterization in the records was specific. The heat exposure shown in the samples resembled the kind produced by smelting operations, not by volcanic or geothermal activity. That is a very specific observation. It is not the kind of casual remark a geologist makes without examining the evidence carefully. The microscopic analysis added another layer. An on-site geologist examining the core samples under magnification found marks in the rock surface that he described as tool marks of unknown origin. This notation is worth examining carefully. A geologist describing marks as tool marks is making a professional assessment that the marks were produced by a tool of some kind, not by natural processes. The qualifier of unknown origin is equally important. It means the marks did not match any tool type the geologist could identify from his professional knowledge. He was not saying the marks resembled known tool types, but were ambiguous. He was saying they did not match known tool types at all. For a trained professional examining rock in the context of an active mining operation, that is a striking observation to record. The samples were sent to San Francisco for further analysis. That decision reflected the seriousness with which at least some people in the operation were treating the observations. Sending samples to an external laboratory for additional examination is not a routine step. It is something done when on-site analysis has produced results that require verification or that exceed the analytical capacity available locally. The decision to send the samples suggested that the on-site findings were considered significant enough to warrant the additional cost and time of external review. And the external review confirmed the on-site findings. The follow-up report stated that the marks in the rock showed signs of tooling. That confirmation was a significant moment in the paper trail of the Comstock's deeper levels. And then the chief engineer who had ordered that investigation was removed from his position. That sequence is difficult to explain as coincidence. An engineer orders an investigation into unusual findings. The investigation produces results that confirm those findings. The engineer is removed. His replacement has a financial background rather than a technical one. The investigation is not continued. The samples and their associated reports disappear from the accessible record. Each of those events, taken individually, might have an ordinary explanation. Personnel changes happen in large organizations for many reasons. Reports get misfiled or lost. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the sequence has a logic to it that ordinary explanations do not fully account for. The removal of a chief engineer immediately following a confirmed unusual finding, and his replacement by someone without the technical background to continue or evaluate the investigation, effectively ended the inquiry at the institutional level. Whatever the unusual findings represented, they would not be pursued further through official channels. The investigation that had been initiated from within the company's own engineering staff, using standard methods and producing confirmed results, was terminated not by a finding of error, but by a personnel decision. The person best positioned to follow the investigation to its logical conclusion was no longer in the role. Watkins was aware of this sequence of events. He had access to the company logs as a shift supervisor, and the personnel changes were documented even if the reasons behind them were not always clearly stated. He had also been observing the physical anomalies underground for long enough to understand that the patterns he was seeing were consistent and concentrated. The deliberate blockages, the unusual drill bit failures, the core sample results, the tool mark findings, and the removal of the engineer who had pursued those findings all pointed in the same direction. They were not isolated events. They were connected, and their connection ran along the same axis that his physical observations had been tracking for years. Everything unusual pointed deeper. What Watkins could not yet determine from his position as shift supervisor was what exactly was down there at those depths that was producing all of these effects. The evidence he had accumulated was circumstantial in the sense that it described consequences without clearly identifying a cause. The deliberate blockages prevented access. The unusual drill resistance suggested something atypical in the rock. The core sample results described characteristics inconsistent with the known geology. The tool marks pointed toward modification of the rock by some process or instrument that the on-site geologist could not identify. Each of these observations described a symptom of something, but what that something was remained uncharacterized, and the institutional mechanisms that might have characterized it had been effectively shut down by the removal of the chief engineer and the discontinuation of the investigation he had initiated. The physical evidence Watkins could observe directly was real. The administrative record of the investigation and its termination was real. The pattern connecting all of it was consistent and pointed in a specific direction. But the question at the center of all of it, what was actually present at the deepest levels of the Comstock that would account for all of these effects, was still open. Watkins had been building toward that question for years, without yet having the means to answer it. The sealed passages prevented direct examination. The institutional investigation had been stopped. The records that might have provided clarity were incomplete or missing. What remained was the pattern itself, clear and consistent, and a direction that everything in it continued to indicate. Downward. In March 1879, Thomas Watkins received an assignment that was different from anything he had been given in his 15 years at the Comstock. The company wanted to push the operation past 3,000 feet. That depth was significant. It exceeded what most mining operations anywhere in the world had attempted at that time. The technical challenges involved in working at that depth were considerable. The heat alone made sustained work nearly impossible. The pressure on tunnel structures at that depth required careful engineering. The logistics of moving men and equipment that far underground and back again were complex and time-consuming. A descent to 3,000 feet was not a routine shift assignment. It required a specific kind of person. The stated purpose of the assignment was exploration rather than extraction. That distinction is worth noting. The Comstock had been a production operation since its earliest days. Every decision about where to sink shafts and how deep to push them was driven by the location of ore bodies and the financial returns they represented. Exploration for its own sake, without a direct connection to extraction planning, was not how the operation normally worked. So an assignment framed specifically as exploration, pushing past the deepest levels that had been previously worked, without an immediate extraction objective, represented a departure from the normal logic of the operation. That departure raises a question the official record does not clearly answer. What were they expecting to find that justified the cost and risk of pushing that deep without a specific ore body as the target? Watkins was selected for the assignment because of his experience and his reliability. Both qualities were relevant. Experience at that depth meant understanding the physical demands of extreme underground conditions and knowing how to manage them. Reliability meant something slightly different in this context. It meant being someone who could be trusted to carry out the assignment without spreading unsettling reports among the broader workforce. Watkins had already demonstrated, through years of quiet observation and careful note-keeping, that he did not speak freely about what he noticed underground. From the company's perspective, he was someone who could go to 3,000 feet, document what was there, and handle the information in a controlled way. What the company may not have fully accounted for was that Watkins kept his own records alongside any official documentation he produced. The descent itself took hours. The elevator systems used in the Comstock could only operate safely to a certain depth. Below that point, the weight of the cables became a structural problem. Watkins descended the lower sections using ladder systems bolted into the rock face. The temperature climbed steadily as he went deeper. By the time he reached the staging platform at approximately 2,900 feet, conditions were at the extreme edge of what a person could endure for any sustained period. The air was thick and hot. Breathing required conscious effort. Water he had carried down for the descent was already warm. The physical environment at that depth was hostile in every practical sense, and he had not yet reached his destination. Below the staging platform, he found a vertical shaft that did not appear on any map he had reviewed in his role as shift supervisor. The shaft was fitted with a rope ladder that appeared recently installed. Someone had been there before him, preparing access to whatever was below. That detail is significant. It means the descent Watkins made in March 1879 was not the first time anyone had been in that part of the mine. Someone had already gone down, assessed the shaft, and installed the equipment needed to access what lay beneath. Who had done that work, and when, is not documented in any surviving company record that has been located. Watkins descended the shaft. He counted the rungs as he went. At approximately 100 feet below the staging platform, the shaft opened into a space that he immediately recognized as unlike anything produced by the mining operation above. What he entered was a chamber, not a natural cave, not a mined-out cavity. A chamber in the architectural sense of the word, an enclosed space with defined walls, a defined ceiling, and a defined floor, constructed with a level of precision that had no equivalent anywhere else in the Comstock. The walls were the first thing he examined carefully. In every tunnel and chamber created by the mining operation, the walls carried the physical record of how they were made. Tool marks, blast scarring, drill holes, the roughened surfaces produced by the various methods of breaking rock. None of that was present here. The walls were smooth. Not approximately smooth in the way that a carefully worked surface might be after extended finishing. Smooth in a way that Watkins, in 2 decades of examining underground surfaces, had not previously encountered in any man-made or natural context. The smoothness was uniform across the entire wall surface. There were no variations, no patches where the finish was incomplete, no areas where the underlying rock texture showed through. Whatever process had produced these walls had done so with complete consistency. The corners confirmed what the walls suggested. Where the walls met each other and where they met the floor and ceiling, they formed angles that Watkins assessed as perfect right angles. He examined them closely. He ran his hands along the transitions from one surface to another. In standard mining work, corners are functional approximations. They are close to right angles, because that is what the work produces. But they are never geometrically precise. Geometric precision in a corner requires finishing work that has no practical purpose in a mine. There is no reason to invest the additional effort. But the corners in this chamber were precise. That precision was not incidental. It was deliberate. And deliberate precision of that kind, at 3,000 feet underground, in a chamber with no connection to any documented phase of the mining operation, does not have an obvious explanation. The ceiling drew his attention next. It was not flat. It was vaulted, supported by arches that rose from the walls and met at a central point above the chamber floor. The arches were carved. That in itself was notable. But what Watkins observed about their construction was more specific than that. Each arch appeared to be carved from a single piece of stone, rather than assembled from smaller blocks. In surface architecture of the 19th century, single-piece stone arches of significant span were rare and represented advanced stoneworking capability. In a chamber 3,000 feet underground, with no documented connection to any surface construction operation, the presence of single-piece carved stone arches raises questions that standard mining geology cannot address. The floor completed the picture. Watkins tested it methodically. He had brought a small metal ball for exactly this purpose, knowing from his years of experience that level surfaces in underground spaces are practically significant for drainage and structural assessment. He rolled the ball across the floor in multiple directions. In each direction, the ball did not move after being placed. It remained stationary. That result indicated a floor level to a degree of precision that exceeded what any mining operation of the time could produce as a standard outcome. Achieving that kind of level surface underground required either extraordinary finishing work or construction methods that produced it naturally as part of the building process. Neither explanation fits comfortably within the known history of the Comstock. At the center of the chamber stood a door. The material it was made from was a dark metal that Watkins could not identify. He examined it as closely as his lamp allowed. There was no rust. There was no corrosion. The surface was intact. For metal at 3,000 feet underground in an environment saturated with moisture and mineral-laden water, the complete absence of corrosion is a property that requires explanation. Metals corrode in that environment. The rate varies depending on the composition of the metal and the specific chemistry of the surrounding moisture, but corrosion over any significant period of time is expected. A metal door showing no corrosion in that environment was either made from a material with exceptional corrosion resistance or had been present for a much shorter time than the chamber surrounding it suggested. Neither possibility is straightforward. The door frame carried markings. Watkins examined them carefully and recorded them in his notebook through sketches and written descriptions. The symbols were not in any language he recognized. He had working familiarity with English and had encountered Spanish in his years in the American West. The symbols matched neither. They were geometric and precise. Some had the character of mathematical notation, organized in ways that suggested numerical or logical relationships rather than linguistic meaning. Others resembled astronomical diagrams, showing arrangements that could be interpreted as star positions or orbital relationships. Still others did not fit either of those categories, and Watkins could not offer a classification for them beyond noting their visual characteristics in detail. The precision of the symbols matched the precision of everything else in the chamber. They were not rough or approximate. They were executed with the same consistency and care visible in the walls, the corners, the arches, and the floor. Whatever made this chamber made it with attention to detail across every element, from the large-scale structural features down to the small-scale markings around the door frame. That consistency is itself a kind of evidence. It suggests a unified construction effort rather than modifications made at different times by different parties. The chamber appears, from Watkins' account, to have been built as a single coherent project. Watkins spent 3 hours in the chamber. He used that time systematically. He measured the dimensions using a rope he had brought for the purpose. He recorded the dimensions in his notebook. He examined every surface he could reach. He sketched the symbols around the door frame as accurately as he could manage under lamplight in extreme heat. He attempted to open the door and found it completely immovable, with no visible mechanism for opening and no gap between the door and its frame that would suggest a conventional hinged or sliding design. He noted the air movement in the chamber, a slight but consistent flow that suggested the chamber connected to other spaces beyond the door. After 3 hours, his water was critically low, and the heat was becoming dangerous. He climbed back up. This is where the explanation starts to weaken considerably. Everything Watkins documented in his notebook describes features that are inconsistent with 2 separate frameworks. They are inconsistent with natural geological formation. Rock does not form perfect right-angle corners, smooth uniform walls, level floors, and vaulted arches through any known natural process. And they are inconsistent with 19th century mining excavation. The Comstock operation did not produce chambers of this kind anywhere else in the mine. No other section of the Comstock shows comparable precision. The methods and equipment available to the operation in 1879 could not have produced the features Watkins described as a standard output of their work. If the chamber was not natural and was not made by the mining operation, then the question of who made it and when does not have an answer within the currently accepted framework of the site's history. That question has not been clearly resolved in the century and a half since Watkins first recorded it in his notebook at the bottom of the Comstock. One of the reasons Watkins' account is difficult to set aside entirely is that it does not stand alone. If his 1879 descent had been the only incident of its kind in the Comstock's history, the case for treating it as an isolated anomaly would be much stronger. A single unusual report from a single individual, however experienced and however detailed, can always be explained in terms that keep the official framework intact. Memory is imperfect. Extreme conditions affect perception. An experienced man under enormous physical stress at 3,000 feet underground might describe what he found in terms that exceeded what was actually there. Those explanations are available, and they are not unreasonable when applied to a single incident. but they become progressively harder to apply as the number of similar incidents increases. And the Comstock produced more than one. The 1862 incident is documented in the surviving records, though not prominently. Miners working at approximately 1,500 feet broke through into a space that their report described as a room of work stone. That language is specific. Work stone is a term with a precise meaning in a mining context. It refers to stone that has been shaped or finished by deliberate human effort, as opposed to stone in its natural state or stone broken by mining tools. A miner using that term to describe what he found was making a professional assessment based on direct observation. He was not using imprecise language. He was describing what the surface characteristics of the stone told him about how it had been treated. That assessment was recorded and passed up through the reporting structure of the operation. An engineer was sent to examine the space. Engineers in the Comstock operation were technically trained professionals with the qualifications to assess geological formations and distinguish them from artificial structures. The engineer who examined the 1862 space produced a report. That report described the room in detail. The dimensions were noted. The surface characteristics of the walls were described. The angles at which the surfaces met were recorded. The report was thorough enough to establish that the engineer had examined the space carefully and documented what he found with professional precision. The conclusion recorded in the official record was that the space was a natural cavity. The space was then sealed. That conclusion is where the first difficulty appears. The term natural cavity has a specific geological meaning. It refers to a void in rock created by natural processes, dissolution of soluble rock by water, collapse of underground voids, gas pocket formation, or other geological mechanisms. Natural cavities have characteristic features that distinguish them from artificial structures. Their walls reflect the processes that created them. Their shapes follow the path of least resistance through the surrounding rock, rather than geometric regularity. Their surfaces show the marks of natural processes, rather than deliberate finishing. An engineer examining a genuine natural cavity would see those characteristics and recognize them. The question that the 1862 report raises is whether those characteristics were actually present in what was found, or whether the natural cavity conclusion was applied to something that did not fully match that description. The report itself, in the portions that survive, describes features that sit uncomfortably with a natural cavity conclusion. The dimensions were described in terms suggesting regularity. The surface characteristics of the walls were noted in ways that implied smoothness inconsistent with natural formation processes. The angles at which surfaces met were recorded with enough precision to suggest they were geometrically significant. These are not the descriptive priorities of an engineer documenting a natural void. They are the descriptive priorities of an engineer documenting something that appeared artificially constructed. Yet the conclusion applied to those observations was natural cavity. That gap between the observations recorded and the conclusion drawn from them is the detail that does not fully make sense. 6 years later, in 1868, a different crew working at approximately 2,000 feet encountered a more extensive find. What they broke into was not a single room, but a series of 3 connected chambers. The chambers were described as carved in a consistent style, with connecting passages between them. The scale of the find was larger than the 1862 incident. 3 connected chambers, with a consistent internal style, represent a more complex spatial arrangement than a single room. Natural geological processes do not typically produce connected chambers of consistent stylistic character. The probability of natural formation producing 3 connected spaces with internal consistency in style and construction is considerably lower than the probability of natural formation producing a single irregular void. The response followed the same sequence as 1862. The find was reported. An engineer was sent to examine it. A report was produced. The official conclusion was natural formation. The chambers were sealed. What the report actually described in detail is less clear from the surviving documentation, because the 1868 records are less complete than those from 1862. But the broad outline is consistent. Unusual chambers found. Engineer investigates. Natural formation conclusion applied. Access closed. The repetition of that sequence across 2 separate incidents, 6 years apart, involving different crews at different depths, is the beginning of a pattern. And patterns in institutional behavior are worth examining with the same care applied to patterns in physical evidence. By the time Watkins descended to 3,000 feet in 1879, at least 3 separate incidents had followed this same procedural sequence within the Comstock's history. The 1862 room at 1,500 feet, the 1868 chambers at 2,000 feet, and whatever Watkins found at 3,000 feet, which produced its own version of the same institutional response. 3 incidents, 17 years apart at the extremes, involving different people at different depths, all following the same 4-step sequence. Find something unusual. Document it. Apply a natural formation conclusion. Seal the access. That consistency is not what random variation in geological discoveries would produce. It looks more like a procedure. A consistent, repeatable procedure applied to a specific category of find. At first, it seems normal that a large industrial operation would develop standard responses to unexpected geological features. Standardized procedures are how large organizations manage complexity. When something falls outside the expected parameters, having a defined response reduces decision-making overhead and maintains operational continuity. A standard procedure for handling unusual finds in a mine is not inherently suspicious. But there's a problem with applying that framework here, because the standard procedures of mining operations are designed to address the operational implications of unusual finds. They are not designed to produce a predetermined conclusion about the nature of those finds regardless of what the evidence actually shows. That is a different kind of standardization. It is the standardization of a conclusion rather than a process. The natural formation conclusion applied in each of these incidents was not a conclusion that emerged from the evidence. It was a conclusion applied to the evidence. The distinction matters. In the first case, an engineer documented features inconsistent with natural cavity formation and then recorded a natural cavity conclusion. In the second case, 3 connected chambers of consistent style were described as natural formations. In the third case, Watkins documented a chamber with architectural precision that he explicitly assessed as inconsistent with natural formation, and was subsequently told by company officials and a government representative that what he had found was a natural geological curiosity. In each instance, the conclusion preceded or overrode the evidence rather than following from it. That is where the explanation becomes difficult. The engineers who wrote the original reports from 1862 and 1868 did not remain in their positions afterward. The 1862 engineer was reassigned to surface work within a short period of producing his report. The details of that reassignment are sparse in the surviving record, but the timing is notable. An engineer produces a report describing unusual features underground. Shortly afterward, he is no longer working at depth. Whether the reassignment was connected to the report or coincidental is not established by the surviving documentation, but the timing places the 2 events in proximity that is difficult to ignore entirely. The 1868 situation followed a similar pattern. The engineer who examined the 3 connected chambers and produced the report that led to their sealing was not in the same role within the year. The surviving records do not provide a detailed account of why. Personnel changes in large organizations occur for many reasons, and most of them are entirely ordinary. The problem is not that an engineer left a role. The problem is that engineers who examined and reported unusual finds at depth consistently left their roles in relatively close proximity to those reports, while engineers working at shallower and less problematic levels showed more continuity of tenure. That difference in career trajectory, correlated with the specific nature of the work being done, is a pattern that the standard explanation of ordinary personnel management does not cleanly account for. The chief engineer who ordered the investigation into unusual core samples and drill bit failures, discussed in the context of the events leading up to Watkins' descent, followed the same trajectory. He initiated an investigation. The investigation produced results that confirmed the unusual nature of what was being found at depth. He recommended bringing in outside specialists. He was removed from the project. His replacement had a financial background rather than a technical one. That sequence repeated the essential structure of what had happened to the engineers in 1862 and 1868. with enough additional detail preserved in the surviving record to make the connection between the investigation and the personnel change difficult to attribute to coincidence. What the pattern suggests, taken as a whole, is an institutional response that was consistent across decades and across different individuals. The response had two components. The first was the application of a natural formation conclusion to findings that the engineers examining them did not clearly describe as natural formations. The second was the removal or reassignment of the engineers who produced those findings from positions where they might continue to investigate or publicize what they had found. Both components appeared together in each incident. Neither component appeared in isolation. Their consistent co-occurrence across multiple incidents spanning nearly 2 decades is the detail that is hardest to account for through ordinary explanations. A single incident of an unusual find being dismissed and its investigator reassigned could reflect organizational politics, financial pressure, or simple professional disagreement about geological interpretation. Those explanations are available and plausible for any single case, but they become progressively less satisfying as the number of cases increases and the pattern across them becomes more consistent. 3 incidents, the same 4-step procedural response. Engineers consistently removed from roles after reporting unusual finds, and a depth gradient that places all of these incidents in the same part of the operation. The pattern does not prove anything with certainty, but it is coherent in a way that random institutional behavior across 2 decades would not be expected to produce. And coherence in a pattern is itself a form of evidence that warrants continued examination rather than dismissal. After his meeting with company officials, Watkins did not stop investigating. The meeting had made the institutional position clear. What he had found at 3,000 feet was to be characterized as a natural geological curiosity. He was expected to accept that characterization and return to his work without raising further questions. Most men in his position would have done exactly that. The professional risk of continuing to pursue something the company had explicitly discouraged was significant. Careers in large industrial operations depended on the goodwill of management, and Watkins had already seen what happened to engineers who pushed too hard on questions the company did not want examined. But Watkins had spent years accumulating observations that the official explanation did not account for. A single meeting with company officials and a government representative was not enough to resolve what he had been building toward for 15 years. His approach after the meeting shifted. He moved away from the internal records of the mining operation, which were controlled by the company and clearly incomplete in ways that were not accidental. Instead, he began looking at sources that existed outside that controlled environment. He started at the Virginia City Library, which held archive materials covering the region's history predating the mining era. What he was looking for was context. The chamber he had found at 3,000 feet existed within a geography and a history that extended far beyond the Comstock operation. If there was information about what that geography contained before the miners arrived, it existed in sources the company had no reason to have managed or suppressed. The Washoe people had inhabited the region around what would become Virginia City for generations before any prospector arrived. They were the indigenous group native to the western edge of the Great Basin, the broad and arid territory that covers much of present-day Nevada. Their presence in the region was not incidental to its history. They had lived in direct relationship with the land and the mountains of that area for a very long time. Their accumulated knowledge of the landscape, including what lay beneath it, was not the knowledge of casual observers. It was the knowledge of people whose survival and cultural continuity depended on understanding the environment they inhabited at a detailed and practical level. That kind of knowledge does not disappear. It gets transmitted through oral tradition, through the accounts of elders passed to younger generations, through the stories that communities use to encode important information about the world they live in. Watkins found archived correspondence from a missionary who had lived among the Washoe people during the 1840s, roughly a decade before the first prospectors arrived in the region. The missionary had recorded Washoe oral traditions in considerable detail as part of his broader effort to understand the culture and belief system of the people he was living among. Those records had been preserved in the library archive without attracting particular attention. They were not the kind of material that mining companies or government surveyors would have had reason to examine. They sat in the archive as historical documentation of a culture and a period that most people passing through Virginia City had little interest in. Watkins read them carefully. What the missionary had recorded about the Washoe relationship with the mountain was specific. The mountain was described as a place to be avoided, not because of physical dangers in the conventional sense, not unstable terrain or dangerous wildlife or hostile neighbors, but because of what existed beneath it. The Washoe elders, as recorded by the missionary, spoke of structures that had been built underground by people who came before. The language used in the missionary's transcription was careful and detailed. The elders described these earlier people as having worked stone and metal in ways that the Washoe themselves had never mastered and did not attempt to replicate. The underground structures were not described as ruins or remnants of something destroyed. They were described as present, still there, below the mountain. The prohibition associated with the mountain was unambiguous in the oral tradition as the missionary recorded it. The mountain was not to be disturbed. This was not framed as a superstition or a general cultural avoidance of unfamiliar places. It was a specific prohibition attached to a specific location with a specific reason. The reason was the existence of something beneath the surface that the Washoe elders considered significant enough to warrant a clear and transmitted instruction. Do not go there. Do not dig there. Do not disturb what is below. That kind of specific prohibition, attached to a specific place and transmitted across generations, encodes real information. Oral traditions of this kind are not random. They persist because the community finds them worth preserving, and they find them worth preserving because the information they contain is considered important. When the first prospectors arrived in the region in the 1850s, the Washoe provided warnings. The accounts of early settlers and prospectors in the area occasionally reference these warnings, generally dismissing them as superstition or as an attempt by the indigenous population to protect territory they valued. The prospectors were not in the habit of taking guidance from indigenous oral traditions about geological conditions. They were looking for silver and gold, and the mountain contained both in quantities that made any other consideration secondary. The warnings were ignored. The digging began, and within a few years, the Comstock operation was producing ore at depths that brought miners into contact with exactly what the Washoe had described. That alignment between the oral tradition and the physical findings of the mining operation is a detail that does not resolve easily in either direction. It is worth being careful about how to interpret oral traditions in an investigative context. Oral traditions can encode genuine historical knowledge. They can also encode explanations for natural phenomena that are culturally significant, but not literally descriptive. A mountain that is seismically active, or that produces unusual sounds, or that has visible geological features suggesting underground activity, might generate oral traditions warning against disturbance, without those traditions pointing to anything constructed beneath the surface. That is a legitimate interpretive possibility. But the Washoe tradition as recorded by the missionary was not vague or metaphorical in its description. It described structures built by people, worked stone and metal, underground spaces with specific characteristics. That level of descriptive specificity is harder to account for as a symbolic encoding of natural phenomena. Watkins continued his research beyond the library archive. Through his network of professional contacts in the mining and surveying communities of the American West, he eventually learned about a man named Edward Thompson. Thompson had a professional background as a surveyor, having worked on railroad projects across the Western Territories during the expansion of the rail network in the years following the Civil War. That work had taken him across a large geographic area and brought him into contact with a wide range of people, including miners, prospectors, and indigenous communities across multiple territories. And during those years of travel and work, Thompson had been quietly collecting something that had no official category and no institutional home. Thompson had been documenting incidents. Specifically, he had been collecting accounts of chambers and artifacts found at depth during mining and excavation operations across the Western Territories. His documentation covered locations in Arizona, New Mexico, and southern Colorado, as well as Nevada. Each incident in his collection followed a recognizable structure. An excavation operation broke through into a space or encountered an object that did not fit the expected geology. The find was reported, An official investigation or assessment followed. The find was dismissed or characterized as a natural formation or a geological curiosity. Access was closed. The documentation of the find was incomplete or difficult to locate afterward. Over the years Thompson had been collecting these accounts. He had assembled records of more than 30 separate incidents following that pattern across the region. That number is significant. 30 incidents is not a small sample. It represents a body of evidence that, if taken seriously, would require substantial explanation within the framework of Western geological history. Thompson was aware of that. He had attempted to bring his collection of accounts to the attention of institutions that might have the resources and authority to investigate them properly. He had approached academic journals with manuscripts presenting his findings. He had contacted institutions with interests in geology and archaeology. He had tried to organize funded expeditions to examine some of the documented locations directly. None of these efforts produced results. The journals declined his submissions. The institutions did not fund the expeditions. The pattern of dismissal that characterized each individual incident in his collection also characterized the reception of his attempt to document the collection as a whole. The reasons given for declining his submissions and expedition proposals were varied. Some journals cited insufficient evidence. Others questioned his methodology. Some institutions expressed concerns about the sources he was relying on. These are the standard responses available to any institution declining to engage with material it finds outside its acceptable framework. They are not necessarily dishonest responses. An institution evaluating unusual claims applies higher standards of evidence than it would to claims consistent with existing knowledge, and Thompson's evidence, while extensive, was largely testimonial and secondhand. That is a legitimate criticism, but this is where it becomes unclear, because the same standards were not applied consistently to other categories of historical claim that relied on similar types of evidence. The geographic distribution of the incidents in Thompson's collection is one of the most significant aspects of his work. The 30-plus incidents he documented were not clustered in a single location or a single type of geological formation. They were spread across a large area of the Western Territories, covering different geological contexts, different types of mining operations, and different indigenous territorial areas. That distribution is difficult to account for if the finds being reported were genuinely natural formations of the kind the official conclusions claimed. Natural geological formations of an unusual type tend to cluster in areas of similar geology. They do not appear with consistency across diverse geological environments spread over hundreds of miles. The geographic spread of Thompson's incidents points toward something that was not geology dependent, and the consistent pattern of suppression across all of those geographically diverse incidents points toward something that was not locally driven. Watkins and Thompson eventually made contact. The details of how that connection was established are not fully documented in the surviving record, but by the early 1880s, they were corresponding. Thompson examined Watkins' notebook and the artifact Watkins had removed from the chamber. He recognized both as consistent with what he had been collecting across the Western Territories. The artifact in particular matched descriptions in several of his documented incidents from other locations. Objects of similar material and similar surface characteristics had been reported in Arizona and New Mexico excavations before being confiscated or disappearing from accessible documentation. That consistency across geographically separated incidents, independent of each other and of the Comstock specifically, is what Thompson had been trying to bring to institutional attention without success. The question that emerges from Thompson's collection, taken alongside the Washoe oral tradition and the Comstock incidents, is one that the official record of Western mining history has never directly addressed. Natural formations do not replicate themselves consistently across hundreds of miles of diverse geology. Isolated hoaxes do not produce the same institutional response pattern in 30 separate locations over decades. The Washoe oral tradition, recorded before the mining era, describes underground structures in terms that correspond to what miners later found, and every attempt to investigate the accumulating body of evidence was met with the same response: dismissal, closure, and the removal of the people best positioned to continue the investigation. That combination of a geographically broad physical pattern and a geographically consistent institutional response is what Thompson had been documenting. And it is what Watkins, after his own experience at 3,000 feet, recognized as something larger than anything the Comstock records alone could explain. When examining what Watkins and others documented across the Comstock and the broader Western Territories, the honest starting point is to acknowledge that more than one interpretation exists. This is not a situation where the evidence points so clearly in a single direction that all other explanations can be set aside. The evidence is unusual, and it is consistent in ways that are difficult to dismiss entirely. But it is also incomplete, partially secondhand, and filtered through the limitations of 19th century documentation and analysis. Approaching it fairly means taking each available interpretation seriously and examining where each one holds and where each one encounters difficulty. That is a more useful exercise than selecting a preferred conclusion and working backward from it. The first and most scientifically grounded interpretation is that the chambers and the features within them are the product of unusual but entirely natural geological processes. This is not a dismissive explanation. It is a substantive one that draws on well-established geology. Rock under extreme pressure over very long periods of time can produce surfaces that appear smoother and more regular than the casual observer might expect. Mineral crystallization in enclosed spaces can generate geometric forms, including angles that approach right angles and surfaces that approach flat planes. The specific chemistry of the Comstock Formation, which involves unusual concentrations of various minerals in close proximity, creates conditions for crystallization patterns that are not typical of more common geological environments. These are real processes, and they are capable of producing formations that, under lamplight, in extreme heat at the bottom of a mine shaft, might be interpreted as artificial by even an experienced observer. That explanation deserves to be taken seriously, and it should not be set aside simply because it is the explanation that official sources offered at the time. The fact that an explanation was used to suppress investigation does not make it wrong. Natural geological explanations for unusual underground formations are correct in the vast majority of cases. The human tendency to see pattern and intent in random natural processes is well documented and operates even among trained professionals. An experienced miner working under extreme physical stress at depths that were at the edge of human endurance in 1879 is not immune to that tendency. These are legitimate considerations when evaluating Watkins' account. But this is where the natural formation explanation starts to encounter difficulty. It accounts reasonably well for the chamber itself, or at least for some of its features. Smooth walls, approximately regular angles, vaulted ceilings are all within the range of what geological processes can produce under the right conditions. What it does not account for is the metal object. The chamber could be argued as natural. The object cannot. Watkins removed a physical artifact from the chamber and had it examined by a professional metallurgist in San Francisco. That examination was not cursory. The metallurgist spent 2 weeks analyzing the object. His findings were specific and documented. The metal composition did not match any known natural alloy. Natural alloys exist, but they have known compositions and known formation conditions. What the metallurgist found in the object from the Comstock chamber did not fit within those known parameters. The surface of the object carried etched patterns. Etching on metal does not occur through natural geological processes. It is a deliberate act requiring tools, intent, and skill. The patterns themselves added another layer to the difficulty of explaining the object naturally. They included what the metallurgist described as mathematical calculations, organized in structured arrangements that implied deliberate encoding of information. They also included representations that resembled star charts, but the celestial configurations shown in those representations did not correspond to known constellations as they appear from Earth. That detail is one of the harder ones to explain in any framework. Known star charts, even very old ones, show constellations that are recognizable because the stars themselves have not moved significantly relative to each other over human historical timescales. A star chart showing configurations that do not match any known celestial arrangement raises questions that neither the natural formation explanation nor straightforward historical attribution can easily answer. The second interpretation moves in a fundamentally different direction. It proposes that what Watkins found, and what Thompson had been documenting across the Western Territories was evidence of a civilization that existed in North America before the accepted timeline of human habitation and development in the region. A civilization that built underground structures at significant depth, worked metal with techniques that exceeded what is attributed to pre-contact North American cultures, and left behind physical evidence that has been systematically encountered and systematically suppressed across a large geographic area over more than a century of mining and excavation activity. This interpretation has no mainstream academic support. It sits outside the boundaries of accepted archaeology and history. That lack of mainstream support is a significant point, and it should be stated clearly. Academic consensus on pre-contact North American history is built on a large and diverse body of evidence gathered over many decades by many independent researchers. That consensus does not have obvious gaps that would accommodate a deeply developed underground civilization of the kind this interpretation proposes. The absence of surface evidence, the absence of biological and genetic traces, the absence of any convergent confirmation from independent fields of inquiry are all serious problems for this interpretation. Some believe the suppression of evidence explains these absences. Others disagree and find that argument circular. Both positions exist and neither can be resolved with the evidence currently available. What Thompson found persuasive about this interpretation was not any single piece of evidence, but the combination of geographic breadth, physical consistency, and institutional response pattern. 30 incidents across a large and geologically diverse area, all involving similar finds, all handled through the same suppression procedure, pointed to something that was not local or accidental. Thompson was a trained surveyor. He understood how to read spatial patterns. The pattern he saw in his collected incidents was not consistent with isolated natural formations or isolated individual misidentifications. It was consistent with the distributed physical phenomenon being managed through a coordinated institutional response. Whether that phenomenon was evidence of a pre-contact civilization or something else entirely, Thompson concluded that it was real and that it was being deliberately kept outside public knowledge. The third interpretation occupies a different space from the other two. It does not require either natural formation processes or a pre-contact civilization. It proposes instead that the suppression of these findings was driven not by knowledge of what was there, but by uncertainty about it. The argument runs roughly as follows. In the 1860s and 1870s, the Comstock was a major financial operation with significant investor exposure and a workforce that needed to function under already extreme conditions. The discovery of genuinely unexplained features at depth, features that no one could characterize with confidence, represented a specific kind of institutional risk. It was not the risk of a known problem requiring a known solution. It was the risk of an unknown problem with unknown implications. In that context, the precautionary sealing of unusual finds and the removal of engineers whose investigations were producing uncertain results could reflect institutional risk management rather than deliberate concealment of something specific. The companies involved did not need to know what was down there to decide that having it remain inaccessible was preferable to having it become a subject of public discussion and investor concern. A chamber that no one can explain is a more serious problem for a publicly traded mining operation than a cave-in or a gas pocket. Those are known risks with known responses. An inexplicable chamber at 3,000 feet with features no one can account for is a different category of problem entirely, and sealing it and discouraging discussion of it is a reasonable institutional response to uncertainty rather than a response to specific knowledge. This interpretation has a certain practical plausibility. It does not require the existence of a coordinated long-term suppression effort with clear intent and clear knowledge. It only requires a series of individual institutional decisions made under conditions of uncertainty by people whose primary concern was the operational and financial continuity of the enterprise. Each decision, taken on its own terms, would be defensible as prudent management. The cumulative effect of many such decisions, made over decades by different people in different organizations, would produce exactly the pattern that Watkins and Thompson observed without any single person or institution having planned it as a coherent program. But this interpretation also has a difficulty. It explains the sealing of the chambers and the management of information within the mining operations. It is harder to extend to the behavior of the government representative who attended Watkins' meeting with company officials. A representative of the United States Geological Survey attending an internal company meeting to deliver a prepared natural formation explanation for findings that the company's own engineers had not been able to characterize as natural suggests a level of coordination that goes beyond individual companies managing their own operational uncertainty. The presence of a government representative at that meeting, with a rehearsed explanation that Watkins found implausible given his direct observation, implies that the institutional response extended beyond the mining companies themselves. That detail does not fit cleanly into the precautionary risk management interpretation. None of the three interpretations accounts for all of the available details. The natural formation explanation handles most of the physical features of the chamber, but cannot account for the metal object and its analysis. The pre-contact civilization interpretation accounts for the physical evidence most comprehensively, but has no supporting confirmation from independent fields and requires accepting a historical framework that mainstream scholarship does not support. The precautionary risk management interpretation explains the institutional behavior without requiring specific knowledge of what was found, but does not fully account for the coordinated government involvement that the surviving record suggests. What all three interpretations share is that they are working with incomplete information. The physical evidence that would most clearly distinguish between them, the metal object, has not been located. The chambers themselves remain sealed and inaccessible. The records that might clarify the institutional response are partially missing. The analysis reports that confirmed unusual findings have disappeared from accessible archives. In that situation, the honest position is that the available evidence supports serious questions without supporting definitive conclusions. The interpretations that have been proposed each capture something real about the situation while leaving other aspects unexplained. That incompleteness is itself a significant feature of this case. If the natural formation explanation fully accounted for what was found, there would be no reason for the institutional responses that are documented in the surviving record. Ordinary geological discoveries do not require the removal of engineers or the attendance of government representatives at internal company meetings. The institutional behavior implies that something about these finds warranted a response beyond what standard geological curiosity would require. What that something was remains, across all three interpretations, the central unanswered question, and the fact that it remains unanswered more than a century after Watkins first documented it in his notebook at the bottom of the Comstock, is not because the question has been examined and found to have no answer. It is because the examination has consistently been prevented before it could reach one. Thomas Watkins spent the last 2 decades of his life trying to make someone care about what he had found. He wrote letters. He corresponded with researchers. He filled additional notebooks with observations, theories, and attempts to place what he had documented at the Comstock within a broader historical context. None of those efforts produced the institutional response he was looking for. The journals did not publish his accounts. The universities did not respond to his correspondence. The newspapers that occasionally covered unusual historical claims did not find his story credible enough to pursue seriously. By the end of his life, the man who had descended to 3,000 feet and documented what was there in meticulous detail had been effectively reduced, in the eyes of the institutions he had tried to reach, to the status of an eccentric with an unusual story. He died in Portland in 1903 without having received any formal acknowledgement that what he had found warranted serious investigation. That outcome was not unusual for people in his position. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period when institutional science was consolidating its boundaries and defining what counted as legitimate inquiry. Claims that fell outside those boundaries were not evaluated on their merits in the way that claims within the accepted framework were. They were categorized and dismissed. The categorization was efficient and final. A man who claimed to have found an architectural chamber at 3,000 feet underground, complete with a metal door and unidentifiable symbols, was placed in a category that did not require detailed engagement. The institutional machinery for dismissal was well developed and operated without much friction. Watkins encountered it repeatedly and consistently over 20 years of correspondence and attempted publication. What survived him was physical. His notebooks, 12 pages of detailed documentation written the night of his descent, supplemented by years of additional observations and correspondence. His daughter Margaret inherited them after his death. She kept them. That decision, which may have seemed like simple family preservation of a parent's papers, turned out to matter more than anyone involved could have anticipated at the time. The notebooks went into storage in her home and remained there for 50 years. Margaret Watkins died in the early 1950s. Her estate included the notebooks, and she had arranged for them to be donated to the Oregon Historical Society in 1954. The society accepted the donation and placed the collection in its archive, and there the notebooks sat, largely unexamined, for another 30 years. Archival storage is not the same as preservation in any active sense. Materials placed in archive storage are protected from deterioration, but they are not necessarily examined or cataloged in ways that make them accessible to researchers with specific interests. A collection donated in 1954 might sit in storage for decades before anyone with a relevant background and questions encounters it. That is what happened with Watkins' notebooks. They were in the archive. They were physically preserved, but they were not connected to any ongoing inquiry because no one examining the archive knew to look for them specifically. The connection between what Watkins had documented and the broader questions about unusual underground finds across the Western Territories existed only in the notebooks themselves, sitting in boxes in a storage facility in Oregon, unread. In 1987, a researcher named Michael Cremo was working on a project that would eventually become a book examining anomalous archaeological finds, instances where physical evidence appeared to contradict the accepted timeline of human history and development. Cremo was surveying historical archives for exactly this kind of material. He found the Watkins collection in the Oregon Historical Society's holdings. He examined the notebooks. What he found there was consistent with other material he had been gathering from different sources across different regions. The precision of Watkins' observations, the consistency of his account across the original documentation and the later notebooks, and the physical detail he had recorded matched the standard of evidence Cremo was applying to his broader project. He published excerpts and analysis in his 1993 book. The academic community's response to that publication followed the pattern that had by then become familiar across the history of this material. The book was dismissed. The dismissal was efficient and categorical. The specific evidence Watkins had documented was not engaged with in detail by the critics. The broader framework of the book's argument was characterized as outside acceptable scholarly boundaries, and that characterization was treated as sufficient grounds for setting aside the specific cases it contained. Watkins' notebooks, which had survived 50 years in storage and 30 years in an archive before finally reaching a researcher who recognized their significance, were effectively dismissed again, this time not by the institutions of the 1880s and 1890s, but by those of the 1990s. The mechanism was different. The outcome was the same. The artifact, however, was gone. Watkins had removed it from the chamber in 1879. He had taken it to San Francisco for metallurgical analysis. He had corresponded about it with Edward Thompson. He had described it in detail in his notebooks. But at some point between the 1880s and the discovery of the notebooks in 1987, the physical object had disappeared from any traceable location. It was not with the notebooks when they were donated to the Oregon Historical Society. It was not referenced in any estate or property records that researchers have been able to locate. The metallurgist's report from San Francisco, which would have provided independently documented analysis of the object's composition, was also not among the surviving materials. The physical evidence most capable of anchoring the account to verifiable reality had vanished along with the institutional records that would have supported it. That disappearance is one of the more persistent difficulties in assessing the overall case. The notebooks are detailed and consistent. Watkins' professional credentials and experience are documented independently of the notebooks themselves. The pattern of incidents across the Comstock's history is supported by surviving company records and engineering logs. The broader geographic pattern Thompson had documented is referenced in multiple independent sources. But the artifact that would have provided the clearest physical evidence of something genuinely anomalous is not available for examination. Its absence does not disprove what the notebooks describe. but it removes the category of evidence that would be hardest to explain away. In 2003, more than a century after Watkins' death, a group of researchers formally requested access to the sealed sections of the old Comstock district. The request was organized, documented, and submitted through appropriate channels. The researchers were not amateur enthusiasts. They had professional credentials in relevant fields. They outlined their research objectives clearly. They addressed the practical concerns that governed access to old mine workings, including safety protocols and the structural considerations involved in entering sealed sections that had not been accessed for over a century. The request was denied. The reasons given centered on safety concerns, structural instability, and liability issues associated with the age and condition of the sealed sections.